You do a wonderful job of breaking the book into three major sections before you get to the solution. The lost girls, the mean girls, and no girls. Talk a little bit about that first category, the lost girls, the girls that are broken and yet are the ones who set the table for feminism as we see it today.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. One of the patterns that really emerged from my research was, I looked back at all these women, Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and certainly Kate Millett and others that came later. But 201, these were all incredibly broken women. They all had, major areas in their life that needed healing or that needed, some kind of resolution to. And the hard part is that rather than looking back and saying, I just had horrible parents, the solution was, well, we just need to change parents, which isn't the case in Mary Wollstonecraft's case. And so it was just what happened was this idea of always moving further left, further towards socialism, towards communism, towards libertine ideas to try and fix things without really recognizing the wreckage of that would happen. So there was no sense of, maybe we should go back to something like the Ten Commandments. And in fact, that was actually why a lot of this started, because in the around the time of the French Revolution, the Enlightenment thinkers had taken over, and much of their effort was to get rid of anything that was dependent upon the Bible for their reason and for action. And they wanted to get rid of the Ten Commandments entirely and anything related to the Bible. And so the way that they did that was this dependency on what they called reason and reasoning to, why the way that man should act. So that's the real, basis for a lot of these ideas is just that if they can get rid of tradition and break these taboos, then they can kind of create this utopia. And of course, time and again, all we see is things just getting worse because they're not working within the confines of human nature. And that, just created all of these continual problems to the point where it's very hard to even figure out how to go back because things have gone so far and gotten to be such a mess that it's hard to even imagine plugging back into our, cultural ethos, these, notions like the Ten Commandments and whatnot. So anyway, that's really what the lost girls have brought us is these are the women that are, incredibly broken. They shouldn't be anywhere near public policy. And yet they're the ones who have really dictated the way that women think in the world today.
You just mentioned the French Revolution, and that was a real seminal point in history for establishing a secular order in place of a spiritual order.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and this is huge. I don't think we can really overstate how significant the French Revolution was in our way of thinking, especially when it comes to feminism, because that's Mary Wollstonecraft, who's considered the godmother of feminism. She's thinking right along the same terms as someone like Thomas Paine, who is called the first socialist, really. This idea of how do we get rid of any kind of hierarchy? How do we get rid of monarchy? How do we get rid of any kind of hierarchy or patriarchy in the church and families? How do we get rid of the military? They just wanted this very flattened society, which, we end up seeing, of course, an effort to make that in communism under the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union. This desire to get rid of all of these structures of humanity that had been built up over centuries. They're trying to get rid of all of them. And that's really the template that feminism followed moving forward was, getting to people to think more like Marxists, without any of these structures, instead of thinking, along in any kind of biblical terms.
Yeah, you mention in your book, this is so poignant and profound, Mary Wollstonecraft. She rejected motherhood, and yet she became the mother of someone who wrote the Gothic novel Frankenstein. The way you cash that out in the book is great reading, but it's powerful because it's a harbinger of that which will come later on, which eventually happened in our generation, the mutilation of people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was one of those insights, when you're writing a book, you don't really always know what you're going to find and how things are going to fit together. And so it was pretty remarkable to see, to look at someone like Mary Shelley, who Mary Shelley was married to Percy Shelley, who was a huge romantic, huge force for breaking down any kind of taboo. He also is, curiously, was the one that came up with what I call the three pillars of feminism. It was in his work that's what feminism became moving forward. And these ideas were free love, the occult, and smashing the patriarchy. He put all those things together in his work in what he called the women's revolution. So she's Mary Shelley then, and they're both of them are fascinated by this idea of creating and creation and science and electricity, all these kinds of new concepts. And so it's really interesting to see that she creates in the book Frankenstein this creature who ultimately is just this miserable, just unloved creature. And, in many respects, people speculate that she was sort of putting herself in that because she probably felt a certain amount of guilt that her mother died after she was born. And, she ran away from her father to be with Shelley before Shelley was divorced from his first wife. And anyway, there was just a mess in her life. And, so there's this desire to sort of create something out of nothing using technology. And of course, they didn't have the technology to do what we're doing today. And that's the amazing thing, is to see the lengths that people are going to sort of make themselves whole in the way that Mary Shelley probably longed for. It certainly is in the book of Frankenstein, in The Creature. And, now we're seeing this with, if we just change some body parts out, then somehow that's supposed to bring healing to what it is that people are really suffering, which of course will never bring healing to it. And this is why we see, the fruits of it, that suicide levels are much higher after any kind of trans surgeries. And, we also see it in feminism itself, just how miserable women are. And these are the statistics that most feminists will never talk about, just the rise in depressions, suicide attempts, or successful attempts at suicide, substance abuse, divorces. All of these kinds of things are really pointing to incredibly unhappy people because, again, we're not working with human nature. We're working directly against it to create something of our own imagining.
You just mentioned the word romantic. What did, maybe another way of putting this, what was the role that Romanticism played in the advancement of feminism?
Oh, I think it was a huge, huge role. I mean, Romanticism, of course, is reacting to the very sort of strict logic of many Enlightenment thinkers like Immanuel Kant. And, the Romantics wanted mystery. They wanted, they wanted emotion. They wanted things that went against this what they saw as very sterile logic. And Percy Shelley was absolutely, a romantic poet who was trying to push taboos and sort of get out of anything that they considered, archaic or just old. I think that it was a huge influence, and we probably never would have gotten the feminism that we inherited without the Romantic movement, because it also worked very much on the principles of emotion instead of on reason and logic or any kind of tradition. I think it can't be overstated how much Romanticism played into the movement itself.
And you look today at the relationship between the occult and the destruction of the patriarchy that you're talking about earlier, and that was part of what came out of the Romantic movement.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The occult was very much a vibrant element and certainly a piece of Romanticism. Percy Shelley himself was hugely interested in it. And I pulled a lot of these ideas from this actually Swedish thinker's work called Satanic Feminism. And it was published by Oxford University Press. An amazing work in the sense of just showing that the role that the occult played in, during this time period. And it wasn't just one or two people. I mean, it was just widely spread and a very active part of feminism, especially if you move forward, someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She got a lot of her ideas from seances and using mediums, and was very involved in that second great awakening in the United States. But that part of it that especially New York State, that was using a lot of wrapping tables and whatnot to call on the demonic. So yeah, it's pretty amazing when I started digging into it just to see wow, the occult is really a major piece in this. And it comes up again, of course, too, in the 60s and 70s. There's a book called The Sisterhood is Powerful that was hugely popular. It was it's a compilation of work by a woman named Robin Morgan, who I think is still alive. And in it actually has spells in the back of it, sort of for everyday use. So this was a major piece of it, because, of course, the occult, and typically has always been a way to undermine men by women. This is why there's always a female witch that gets a lot more airtime than I think wizards do, because women just saw this as a way to be powerful through witchcraft and through spells and the occult. And so this is why it returns over and over again throughout the movement.
And in recent generations, the personification of that is Madonna.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. Absolutely. And so she's one. I mean, she even just recently, she did a photo shoot in Italy, in the Italian Vogue, that is featuring her as Christ at the Last Supper. And it's, I mean, the pictures are just horrifying to look at, because, of course, there's 12 women who are supposed to be the apostles, and it's just awful. So yeah, she's certainly emblematic of that. But you can see it also in the ways in which most of the pop stars, I think Halsey just did one sort of representing herself as, or more, maybe in the last 2 or 3 years, representing herself as the Virgin Mary. There's this goddess worship going on with women like Beyonce and whatnot. So it's become very popular in the pop world to have these women make themselves goddesses, actually. So it's really tucked in so many remarkable places that you don't expect. And once you start seeing it, it's everywhere. I just wrote a piece a few months ago about, why I can't shop at Barnes and Noble anymore, because it feels like every part of the store is touched in some way with the occult, whether it's products or books or, especially in the children's section, the areas where you don't want your children, dabbling into any kind of cult activity. It seems like it's just everywhere. So yeah, it's I think it's been very subtle, but now it's kind of out in the open in terms of our culture. TV shows, movies, all of that is really not afraid of it as a topic anymore.
I think of Elizabeth Stanton or Susan B. Anthony, and you think these are wholesome feminist women. You paint the other side of the story. Yeah, no,
I think I thought that too. And when I started looking at this, I thought, okay, I'll spend a couple of days researching this. I'm sure I'll find some great quotes I can at least pull to show how, that the first wave feminism was actually good. And I was just amazed. Yeah, I think the Elizabeth Stanton was really crafty. I think she, talk about branding. She did an amazing job of making herself really the center of the suffrage movement. So much so that even the Seneca Falls Convention that people talk about as sort of the start of the suffrage movement, the women's movement, she painted Susan B. Anthony into that story, even though they didn't even know each other at that point. But Susan B. Anthony, they met later, and Susan B. Anthony was single, so she ended up becoming really a voice, the mouthpiece of Katie Stanton. Because Elizabeth was home with her children and couldn't travel the way that Susan B. Anthony could. But basically, what ended up happening was that Elizabeth Cady Stanton did so many things that she shut down the suffrage movement for about 30 years. She was even thrown off the board of her own organization, partially because she wrote this book called The Women's Bible, which is a commentary on Old and New Testament. And it uses all these ideas of atheism, of theosophy, which was this sort of cobbled together New Age religion by this Russian noblewoman, Madame Blavatsky. And Katie Stanton never really called herself an adherent, but she had many of her friends who were involved in the book were adherents to theosophy. So you can see elements of that in her women's Bible. But the other thing was they got very much involved in this scandal with this woman named Victoria Woodhull, who, by the way, Gloria Steinem had a picture of Victoria Woodhull in her office, how many years later, 60, 70 years later, maybe more. But Victoria Woodhull was named by the press Mrs. Satan because she had been a medium her whole life, and she was very much into free love, and she was just this indomitable spirit on the scene in New York City. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were upset they weren't getting enough press, and so they had her come be a speaker. And this just created all kinds of chaos, because then it was finally figured out that there was this big scandal at the heart of it. And anyway, it was this infighting and this scandal, which of course I go into in the book, but it's way too detailed to talk about here, that really, got their reputation was destroyed. And they were, no longer in any way really involved in the suffrage movement. And this is why suffrage didn't happen for another, 30 years after the demise of their effort. But nobody really knows that. I mean, I think most of us think of suffrage and we think of those two, and we don't think of anybody at 1919 and who was involved then. I mean, we just have the sense that these two women were really the cornerstone of it. And we have this impression that they were just these great, noble, women fighting for something really good, but without really knowing any of the much more colorful trimmings of their lives.
Yeah, Elizabeth Stanton in particular. I mean, you can talk about Susan B. Anthony and being minted and all that, but Elizabeth Stanton, I find so interesting. She grew up as a strict Calvinist, and then she becomes the priestess of feminism in the sense of inventing a new Trinity. So instead of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you have feminism, spiritualism, and hypersexuality.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, we don't know that much about Susan B. Anthony at this point. One of her biographers spent 4 days burning her letters, her papers, any of her correspondence, anything that she had left, which, of course, begs the question, why would a biographer do that? Most biographers, hang on to that stuff and make sure that these things are saved for the future. So there's a lot of gaps in our understanding of Susan B. Anthony's life. Although, at certain points I know she was not, she was engaged in the spiritualism. She actually made some statement about how she just wishes that when she spoke publicly, the spirit would just take her over so that she didn't have to do the actual work of it. So anyway, yeah, it's really remarkable to start looking under, behind the curtain a little bit and see this was not some sort of purist movement, but it just had, so much baggage associated with it.
Yeah, talk about Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments. It's based on the Declaration of Independence, and it produces what is arguably the greatest revolution the world has ever known.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is one of the things that happened at her spirit table. She had this idea she was doing this convention, and she didn't know how to make it something bigger than it was. She wanted to make it this huge, like you said, it's huge revolution. So, presumably it's with the help of the spirits, she decides to sort of mimic the Declaration of Independence, and she calls it this Declaration of Sentiments. But curiously, she doesn't really even know what women should be complaining about. The big thing is, of course, the suffrage piece, and that was something that she was very focused on. She had a lot of resentment that actually colored men would have the capacity to vote before she did, and that her racism actually is what splintered the suffrage movement into two different groups. But she, there's this great story about how she's spending all this time trying to figure out what the grievances are, that women should have towards men. And she finally has to ask, I think it's her husband and the husband of a good friend, well, what would middle-class women be upset about? Or poor women be upset about? How do we articulate this? Because she was so wealthy and sort of, protected from all of these realities. She didn't even know how to articulate it herself. And of course, one of the friend's husband jokes about how, these grievances must be really great. If you can't come up with them, you need us to come up with them instead of yourself. So, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on that Stanton obviously, pressed into to make her movement feel like it was, much more significant than it really was.
You sort of hinted at this, but elaborate on the connection between abolitionism and feminism.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting, another one of those cycles. And that we see, because of course abolitionism was happening. You had a lot of people that were abolitionist, and then they sort of hitched their wagon of feminism onto abolitionism, kind of making the comparison that skin color is the same as sex and whatnot. And, this should sound very familiar to all of us, because this is the exact same thing that happened in the 1950s and 60s with the civil rights movement. Because again, you see this rise in feminism, but not only that, in that era, you also see the rise of the gay and lesbian movement. And actually the gays specifically changed the language of their own movement to make themselves victims and victim minorities, the way that the women already had. And this is how they were so successful in sort of changing public opinion, was by changing the narrative about their own behavior. And that was just a really key piece. One of the interesting things that I did not put in the book, though, was that in the 1940s and 50s, there was a woman named Susan B. Anthony II, who was actually the niece of the first Susan B. Anthony. And she was very involved in this communist group called the Congress for American Women. And people were just amazed that she was able to articulate so clearly, what the women's grievances were, and connecting it with abolition and with the African American efforts for equal rights. And it was, it's interesting to see this, because of course all she had to do was go back and read what her aunt had written. It was almost the same kind of rhetoric that was being used. And of course, this time Susan B. Anthony II is really couching it within the Marxist framework, instead of what they were using previously, which was not Marxist, but had much more egalitarian type of language, a little bit less stark than the communist language. But it's interesting to see just these patterns of, all these things that you see in the 1800s. They come back, almost on steroids at a later stage, and are just much more powerful at the 60s and 70s, because of everything that's happening socially and the Cold War and, all kinds of things going on.